I'm sure amongst the audience, there are people who've done this before. And if you have any tips to share, please just raise your hand, and the floor is quite open. So this is not really a high school kind of lecture that we're going to have, but it's just an open floor discourse or discussion. And if you have thoughts, some criticisms, opinions, please feel free to air that. This is what this session is all about. It's a learning curve for both you and me, and etc. And last but not least, we would also want to foster some sort of networking and collaboration opportunities amongst students and lecturers, researchers, etc. And the learning outcomes is at the end of the day, by the end of the day, we would want to acquaint students with the knowledge of the different type of literature reviews and their applicability in relation or with respect to your research objective. Number two, we would also want you to be able at the end of the day to use this acquired knowledge to frame a research question, pick or select the appropriate review pathway that speaks to your research. And by speak to your research, I mean something that answers your research objective. You need to extract data and generate or synthesize an evidence-based review based on PRISMA standards. And PRISMA is an acronym for Preferred Reporting Items for Systematic and Meta-Analysis. So let's deep dive into the issue. We have of late or currently how methods that we adopt for generating a review. And by show of raise of hands, how many of us are PhD students, MSc students, or postgraduate students? By show of raise of hands, okay. See, there's William C, there's Rennie. All right, that's a good number, and I'm sure that a majority of us are, in a way, might not be, and yes, honors students count as postgrad students and are welcome to the presentation. So it doesn't really matter if you are a postgrad student. Even consultants or lecturers have a certain method or methods that they imparted on us. We were supervised by old school guys, brilliant scientists, and their methods that they use or used to generate reviews, and they passed on those skills to us. Not to say these methods they lack evidence, but question is something that we need to keep at the back of our heads as we go along with this discussion. Are these methods as exhaustive and as comprehensive as we would want them to be in terms of generating or extracting and searching for evidence that we can use or literature that we can use to synthesize our research? And also another question to ask is, do these method or methods give us leeway, or do they facilitate some sort of bias reduction when we, or reducing bias or eliminating bias when we select articles that we can read, cite, or in short articles that we could use for synthesizing a review? So these are the questions that we need to ask ourselves oftenly whenever we do an old school literature review approach. So again, another question to ask, if we were to generate that old school literature review, or using old methods, the narrative review, as they would call it, is it replicable? If I were to take your literature review, would I be able to go through the series of steps that you went through and produce pretty much the same document. If we were to produce these things or a particular literature review on a particular subject simultaneously, would we come up with something the same or equivalently the same or with a little bit of deviation? So yes, no, question mark. So these are the questions that we also need to ask. Are they comprehensive? Are they exhaustive? And do they allow for replication? We all know that for science to be called science, there's got to be replicability. Wherever you are, you do your assignments in South Africa or Namibia. If someone were to do the same in Zimbabwe, bar the different climatic conditions, but if we were to follow to the T or to the book what you did or documented, we should at least generate some results that mimic what you have. All right, but can we do that with our old school reviews? So because there was that kind of gap where we couldn't replicate or we couldn't really substantiate the evidence or the methods that we use to gather evidence to synthesize the review, the folks in the medicinal sciences, which is a PRISMA protocol, which is the preferred reporting items for systematic reviews and meta-analysis. So these guys, it has an extension P on it at the end. It's a PRISMA P statement because in medicinal sciences, they develop protocols and clinical trials, etc. But the whole gist behind it was to allow for or treat a literature review as an experiment on its own that is replicable and supported by evidence. All right. So we, of late, since 2012 or 2015 to date, these methods have been adopted in different branches of science. So social sciences, in the natural sciences, agriculture in particular, and they have been evolving, all right? And in their evolution, people were appending or have been gaining or gathering different appendages that would improve and enhance the literature review methodology process with time. You can't stop the evolution of any method because every day as scientists, we are just pushing the envelopes of science. So hence that last bullet point that the statement has been having or evolving, having multiple extensions, and because of the advancement of the knowledge in the synthesis methods. So this is just a background on our old school traditional ways of doing a literature review. How did we adopt medicinal sciences approaches to other branches of sciences in generating evidence-based literature reviews using PRISMA statements? And the PRISMA statement in itself has been constantly evolving because knowledge doesn't stop, all right? So I've included this journal. It's the International Journal of Surgery. Again, because these things originated from the medicinal sciences, they have the nitty-gritty secret ingredients on what motivated them to generate a PRISMA system or a PRISMA statement or PRISMA reviews. And of late, with time, they keep updating those methods so that they stay up to date. And I tried to generate this review, or rather this presentation, using the latest PRISMA statements as updated by Page et al. In the International Journal of Surgery. So this replaces the original 2009 PRISMA statement generated by Moore et al. For keen students, you can go and research on the old 2009 PRISMA statement vis-a-vis, compare this to the 2020 updated. So what new stuff did they really bring up? This statement just replaced the 2009, not in its entirety, but a few updates in terms of they offering new and revised recommended methods to identify, new methods to appraise, and new methods to synthesize your studies. All right. So presentation, at the end of the day, I will acquaint each and every one of us with these methods, new methods or revised new methods to identify, revised new methods to appraise, and revised new methods to synthesize studies. And by synthesis, we mean collecting all the, you gather up a bunch of rubbish, you clean it up, screen, and you are left with a lean, clean sachet or a dossier that you could use to synthesize your, your review. So take home point on this slide is whatever it is that we're learning is an updated version of the 2009 PRISMA statement on how to generate an evidence-based review. And again, because we've been asking questions on that opening slide on old school, are they comprehensive? Are they exhaustive? And are we sure that we've gathered all evidence in generating our review? So in essence, a literature review in its simplest and layman definitions, definition, what we're essentially doing is we want to do a quick overview, a quick analysis, a quick scan on a particular subject or topic or research question on what's there, what is missing, what has been done, what hasn't been done. And through this, that's how we develop research gaps. And a PRISMA statement or systematic methods as detected by PRISMA statements provides us with enough evidence and confidence to actually determine that whatever we're doing, we've thoroughly scoped the landscape, left no stone unturned, read, screened, and whatever we are synthesizing contained in this study or a synthesis of study, which is your literature review, is evidence that on a particular, this is what's there, this is what was done, this is what can be potentially done, or what is ongoing in the particular subject, ongoing research, and what's missing. So in that way, you actually create a literature review that inspires confidence amongst, for yourself and amongst research peers. So in short, gathering research and getting rid of rubbish and summarizing the best of what remains captures the essence and forms the basis of a solid MSc or a PhD study. So a proper literature review or your study, postgrad study, is hinged, or the backbone of it is a well done, thoroughly researched, thoroughly scoped review that then informs of research gaps, challenges, opportunities. Then out of that, you build your proposal and carry on to perform your research. So if again, I would like to reiterate, if you have any question, please feel free to ask, and we want to keep this as interactive as possible. We can have a discussion at any point of the presentation, just so everyone is on the same page and there's clarity. Okay, moving on. So just a quick one, just to acquaint you on the different type of reviews. I'm sure some of you know this, or all of you might know this. We have a SALSA framework, which is a search, appraisal, synthesis, and analysis framework that was developed by Grant and Booth in 2009. And this framework essentially categorized or compartmentalized different kind of reviews. How do we appraise? What do you expect? Method of analysis? What are their shortcomings, etc. So the typologies, according to Grant and Booth, are as follows. You have on this page 7 review types. I've only highlighted the meta-analysis, which I think is of greatest importance, considering that we have a lot of PhD and MSc students and honors students midst, and it's very important that as a postgrad student you engage into a meta-analysis review for your study. It's a practice that we've been pushing our students to do. Whenever you start your PhD or your MSc, your review shouldn't be just a narrative. Put it out there as a meta-analysis, and you'd ask, what is a meta-analysis? So essentially, a meta-analysis it's a technique that you use to compare the effects of the results on a particular subject matter. For example, you want to investigate water use efficiency on a particular crop, water use efficiency on neglected and underutilized crops. And what do? You've actually framed your research objective. Where are these crops grown? You are asking relevant questions. Where are these crops grown? Are they under irrigated agriculture? Are they under rain-fed systems? And what are the yields out of the respective water application methods, rain-fed versus irrigated? If they are irrigated systems, are they using energy, solar, or the local grid electricity? And what are the effects in terms of energy use and water use efficiency? You measure the effects, right? And again, you also measure the same effects using a different pathway, which is rain-fed systems. So you have actually designed a research question. You have actually formulated the kind of, or established the kind of variables that you need to capture in a database, which is essentially an Excel sheet that you can use and populate and then subject that information to statistical analysis. So your synthesis, it's based on quantitative results, statistics, and you build your synthesis and your arguments from that. So that's what a meta-analysis actually entails, and it would be very, very pleasant to hear that some of you guys are doing or have done or are thinking of adopting a meta-analysis for your studies. So not to disqualify all these other review types listed there, I just highlighted a particular review of importance that I'm really familiar with and that I've done quite a lot. All right. And on the next page, there's a scoping review, systematic review. We also have your umbrella reviews, your rapid reviews, etc. So a scoping review can be used, can be hybridized with a systematic review. Scope the horizon, scan the horizon, what's there in terms of the particular subject. Then you systematically employ or employ your Prisma statement to holistically and exhaustively search and scan for that information, screen and proceed to develop or synthesize a literature review. So a scoping review pretty much scans what's happening, what happened on a particular subject, what's currently happening. For example, maybe use of nanotech in agriculture, what's happening, what happened, what's currently happening. You just scope. It's also a little bit of rapid and doesn't really allow for in-depth analysis. But if you then combine it with a systematic, or rather just take the systematic route, you could also answer that question, but in a more depth, quantitative and qualitative manner. Okay, so take time. I've shared this PDF with Dr. Mabuku, and she will circulate amongst you guys just to read through and get you acquainted on the other types that we are not really going to touch on. So the next phase now is to, before we proceed, I just want us to go to the previous slide and let's look at this literature review, just the label number 2, literature review. And I want you to remember or recall the questions that we asked. Are they as exhaustive? Are they as comprehensive? And do they allow or inspire confidence whenever one uses that approach, can they actually be confident in whatever related study that they're doing? Are they inclined to citing it? Are they ? So let's talk about the search. If you look at the search, it's a generic literature review. We've done it. You've done it. Our supervisors have done it. Everyone has pretty much done it. But let's try to pinpoint a few shortcomings. Not to say anything's wrong with it, but it could there are better things out there. It can be better, right? Is it as exhaustive? May or may not include comprehensive searching. All right, fair enough. May or may not include quality assessment. All right, and it's a typical narrative. Analysis may be chronological, conceptual, and thematic, which is good. But if we look at the search appraisal and the search and the appraisal, it pretty much exposes the shortcomings, not as comprehensive in terms of searching your databases, because you work with academic databases like your CAT, Web of Science, Scopus, etc. You might not have scoped through all those databases. And again, risk of bias. There is a high risk of bias because there isn't any quality assessment involved in this. So this pretty much then answers the questions that we've asked previously on the old school narrative reviews. Not as exhaustive and in terms of search, and there is a possibility, a high possibility of a bias because there isn't any quality assessment. So let's move on now to actually the steps, the key steps in generating an evidence-based review. A well-written review contains a methodology, and the methodology essentially informs us that this thing is replicable. If you go through the steps that I did in search, scoping, scanning, and screening for literature, then you could nearly or almost produce the kind of synthesis that I have. And your methodology has key components like the eligibility criteria, the search strategy, inclusion and exclusion criteria, and you can do a strength of evidence check on the searched articles. And the next steps will detail these, each and every one of these components. How do you do it? What is it all about? And how does it feed into the other? How does the eligibility criteria connected to the search strategy? How does the search strategy lead to the inclusion and exclusion criteria? And how do we then perform a strength of evidence? So in essence, in a nutshell, this is what you have for methodology section, and let's unpack each and every one of these components. So eligibility in its simplest definition, Oxford Dictionary, it's pretty much something must meet a certain requirement for it to be included into something, right? It's a quality check of sorts, all right? So in terms of literature reviews, a manuscript or a journal article or a book chapter or a government gazette or any sort of grey literature that you have must meet a certain requirement for it to be included in our literature review. That's a quality check right there. Something that the old school narrative literature review don't give us, all right? And what defines an eligibility criteria? How do we come to a point where we say A, B, C, D articles can actually make it to my literature review? Potentially, because we don't know yet. It's a whole lot of processes that that article has to go through before it can actually qualify. So we have what we call the SPIDER and the PICO frameworks. So these two strategies or frameworks of sorts which we will unpack in the next slide. SPIDA is an acronym for Sample Phenomena of Interest, Design, Evaluation, Research Type Framework, or the PICO, which is Population, Patient, Problem, Intervention, Comparison, and Outcome. So these frameworks have been evolving, especially the PICO. There's the PICOS, the PICOT, but these are the two main frameworks that we can use to actually assess the eligibility of our manuscript. And how do we get to determine that? So the eligibility criteria, in essence, will inform your search strategy. All right. So let's a quick quick advantage, or rather advantages of using these SPIDA and PICO frameworks is it enhances your search process, which is a key factor in preventing bias. You know, you just don't report on articles that you find favorable. You also have to critique articles and include that in your literature review. And they kind of give, or rather they actually give, a holistic and true representation of the available research on a particular subject. So let's look at what PICO and SPIDA really stand for. Let's look at these examples. A health example in a clinical problem. I work in an aged care facility. Urinary tract infection is common. Cranberry juice can help prevent the UTIs, which is the urinary tract infections. I wonder if there's any evidence for that and whether it might be of help to our patients. So if you break down this research question, right, it's got a little bit of background. I work in this aged facility, and UTIs are quite prevalent. I heard that cranberry juice might be a remedy to this. Does it really help? Question mark, research question. So if you break it down into this PICO, like, okay, population or problem or patients, you've got aged people. That's your population or sample. The intervention, which is cranberry juice. The outcome, you want to prevent your UTIs. Let's look at something non-health. Let's look at a library induction for classes and new first-year students, right? Again, the PICO, if you've forgotten, you have population, intervention, comparison, outcome, all right? If you look at this, you have a population, first-year students, intervention, comparison, no intervention, the intervention, background music, and increased retention of information. So I want us to remember this. If you're taking notes, please do take notes. I want to then show you how this weaves into you generating a search strategy. All right, let's look at the other framework, which is the SPIDA, which is Sample Phenomenon of Interest, Design, Evaluation, and Research Type. For example, a SPIDA example, what are the experiences of first-year university students in using a library? Again, the sample first-year students, the phenomenon of interest in library use, the design, you want to do a survey to determine that, right? And the evaluation is experiences, perceptions, etc., depending on the nature of your study. And what are the research type? Is it quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods? So by breaking down these statements, or rather your research question, you can actually use these SPDER statements as search words for articles that might help you in synthesizing a review. Let's go back to PICO. You could actually use these statements, right, for PICO first-year students in an academic library. So you've got first-year students or freshmen and academic library or face-to-face induction. All right, you've got background music, you've got classroom. You just break down these words, right? No intervention, status quo, and the outcome retention, information, and improve student comfort. These are perceptions, right? So you could break down these if you perfectly formulate your research question, apply these frameworks, you could break them down into individual statements that you can further break down to come up with search words. How then do you use this, or how do they feed into the search criteria or search strategy? Let's talk about that. So you have a search strategy, right? So in essence, a search strategy has 4 steps. You identify your databases of interest, Scopus, Web of Science, etc., DJOA, etc. Define a search strategy. How do you define this? You formulate a series of words that can retrieve the maximum number of articles that we can further screen, then pretty much retrieve a lot of rubbish that we need to screen and separate grain from chaff, then we can have the grain. And use Boolean operators, all right, to combine these search words that you formulated in step 2, and step 2 weaves into those Pico and Spider frameworks. Those statements that we've used to actually break down a research question, we can further break them down into single words that we can join with Boolean statements or Boolean words, and Boolean words or operators and, or, not, no. All right, you can use these to combine, and once you combine these, right, you will essentially have a search string. All right, words combined with Boolean operators formulate a search string, and that in itself is a search strategy. All right, so all these steps need to be outlined in your methodology section. Really brief and straightforward, right? Provide a search string. The framework that you've applied, depending on the nature of your study. Is it Pico, Picos, Spider? You break it down. You don't have to tell us that you broke it down, but just do a summary of the key search words that you combined with your Boolean operators. So for step 4, depending on the broadness of your study, right? You might want to be really specific with the way that you search, or would you use wildcard methods? So let's talk about step 4 in detail. So, but before I proceed, are we all following? Are we still on the same page? And if not, please, let's have a discussion. I have to take some water. My throat is burning. All right, so excuse me for that. For a detailed search method in Scopus or any other database using Boolean operators, you can just visit this YouTube video. It's free online, very detailed, 2 minutes long, shows you how specific and wildcard searching really, how one really goes about those two and how do they enhance your search strategy. So once you've done this, you've identified a database, you've applied those words that you've broken down using a Pico or Spider framework, depending on the nature of your study. You've actually extracted words that you join with Boolean operators to create a search string. And once you create a search string, proceed to search and retrieve articles. All right. Once you retrieve articles, the next process would be screening, and screening is informed by what we call an inclusion and exclusion criteria. What is this all about? Let's have a look. So, but before we proceed, just a quick example. This is an ongoing study that we are doing on agricultural water management in Southern Africa, particular interest in irrigation schemes, and in South Africa and Zambia. All right, so we had a criteria, like for example, irrigation development pathways, and the phenomenon of interest. We want to look at the African Union irrigation development and agricultural water management pathways. Our design was literature extraction on different studies that talk about agricultural water management practices, which is AWM. And what is the evaluation? A comparative analysis on performance and adoption rate of agricultural water management pathways that relate to the AU. And our research type, we are using mixed methods, qualitative and quantitative. But the key here is column number 4 on the example search terms, right? Let's look at the row number 2 on the phenomenon of interest. We have those or fluid, unconventional water use, or etc. But if you look at the first section, it's the same words, but sandwiched by different things. For the first section, we have open inverted commas and then asterisk, a word, open inverted quotation, a word, asterisk, then we close the quotation, all right? Put a Boolean operator, or then again, open, word, asterisk, close. Same goes on the another search method. You use curly brackets, same words, just different stuff sandwiching those words, so to speak. But what is the significance of this? So if you look at those open and closed inverted commas, they pretty much give you, that's what we call a wildcard search. They just search randomly and it brings out a wide array of articles, all right? But if you really want to be specific with your search, you use those curly brackets. And with our study, we used the curly brackets. Why? Because we're talking about irrigation, agricultural water management. These are well-researched, a well-researched field of study, and we just gotta be specific with our search. Otherwise, if we were to do a wildcard search, it will just retrieve God knows how many number of articles, and could really give us a run for our money to screen those articles, right? So we had to do the curly bracket search, which is more specific and it targets, right? And we had to talk about sample South Africa or Zambia, all right? So in as much as it gives you a wide array of search results, but they are pretty much focused on South Africa or Zambia, right? All right, so these are the two different search items. If you really want to be specific, use your curly brackets. If you want to retrieve or perform a wildcard search, go with the opening and closing inverted commas together with an asterisk. So the first option, these are open and closing commas and the asterisks, it's really advisable to use that approach when you have, say, a new study. There are emerging sciences of IoT in agriculture. Very few publications. There are emerging sciences of the water, energy, food nexus. There are emerging sciences of nanotech in agriculture. These areas haven't been extensively published, so you would want to use a wildcard search to increase your chances of retrieving as many articles as you can. So in essence, if you apply a wildcard search on a newly researched research frontier, or rather a new study, you're pretty much giving yourself a fighting chance, because you really want to retrieve as many articles as you can, and increases your chances of actually retaining a lot of articles. All right, so move on to just a pictorial view of breaking down your words and using Boolean operators, right? My apologies, my camera. All right, this is okay. So you want to use Boolean operators to combine words and form a search string, which is a search strategy in essence. So you have your first and second term. For part A, first term and second term, and is an exclusive probability or and is quite exclusive, right? It excludes some elements. It's very specific. Or is very broad, okay? So as depicted on that A, and only talks about the intersection, commonality. The part B, or it's quite broad, kind of yields whatever is in relation to the first term and the second term. And if you use part C, the not first term, not second, we are only concerned about the first term. That's a limit to kind of search approach. And part D, we could use or and another or. So this is all encompassing of whatever is in relation to the first and second term, and whatever in relation that is in relation to the third and fourth term, all combined. Do we have an intersection? So this is how a Boolean operator does, or that's how typically a search process occurs or happens in Scopus. All right, this is how we retrieve. We are not really concerned about the back end. I'm just trying to give you an idea of what this essentially means when we do a search strategy and apply Boolean operators to join the words and come up with a set string, and how does it happen in the back end? Okay. So if you recall, we spoke about eligibility criteria, number one. We spoke about the search strategy. Now that we've retrieved our articles, the next step would be screening, right? And screening is informed by an inclusion and exclusion criteria. What is it that we can use to exclude articles? So it's pretty much academic, right? Straightforward. Obviously, so you don't want anything in your review that comes from predatory journals. You don't want that. You don't want articles not written in English. You might get articles in Mandarin, but if you're good in interpreting or translating, well and good. But ideally, you just want articles written in the standard language that everyone understands, right? You also don't want articles with insufficient and irrelevant results, all right? Discussions and conclusions. What do we want? We really want articles of original research in peer-reviewed journals. That's quality, right? That in itself is a quality check, all right? Books and chapters, they are also peer-reviewed. MSc and PhD thesis. Universities publish their MSc and PhD thesis, and also there's some sort of quality assurance. So you could see that with each and every step that we're doing, even from the eligibility criteria all the way to the screening process, there's some sort of quality check involved, and this gives credibility to our review. All right. Once you've defined your inclusion and exclusion criteria, you can expand this. You could also include in the inclusion factors government gazettes, government reports, research reports by SASCAL, etc., or IWMI or Waternet, etc., right? You can, and you just have to justify why are you putting those. Have they been thoroughly and peer reviewed? If yes, they do tick the box. And also, you'd also need to justify that you had to use a lot of gray literature. If you recall, we spoke about newly or emerging sciences that are not extensively published. So you'd really want to capitalize on every bit of literature out there to synthesize and generate your own literature review. Okay. So how does this screening process happen? So you might retrieve some articles in Web of Science, and once you've done that, you could download, share, or sit down with a bunch of experts, screen maybe by title, abstract, and keywords. If that's not enough, if you have the time, and these reviews, they are really time consuming, you might have to actually read through the whole article and see if it fits your criteria. Does it fit the inclusion and exclusion criteria? Is it answering our research objective? Those are the two critical questions that you need to ask. And if you have access to screening softwares such as Distiller, Ryan, there's a whole lot, or Miller, you can actually use it. And I had to highlight on Oran Miller. It's something that we developed with our research groups down here. It's an in-house software. We are just expanding its library modules. And once it's done, we will make it open access, then give it to scholars so that they can utilize and perform screening exercises. So what it essentially does, or what these softwares in a nutshell do, you can download a CSV file or an RIS file format, import it, or rather export it to the software, Distiller, Ryan, or Oran Miller, and you invite reviewers, review, score, weigh, then at the end of the day, it just grades the articles that everyone agreed on using. So it's quite subjective, but because pretty much like your analytical hierarchy process, but because it's experts engaged in the screening, there is some degree of truth in it. All right. A little bit of objectivity because an expert is involved, and an expert could be you, a fellow researcher, a supervisor, a postdoc student in your faculty, or a consultant in the industry. All right. And once you do that, you can actually then generate a report. So this report outlines articles that have been screened. We had 50 articles from our database search that we imported. We then screened and we are left with 20. Out of these 20, we now then have to read thoroughly, read through, then build arguments that lead to a synthesis of your literature review. So another screening process, if you really want to be finicky, if you've done that screening process with the manual screening process or using any one of those softwares, you could apply this method by these researchers, Koutsos et al. The publication reference there available on Google Scholar or Web of Science. It's available. It's open access, I think. So you can actually then further group your articles, right, depending on the strength of evidence. And strength of evidence, it's determined by the type of research and the study design and the study type. So once you group this, especially those ones that have a strong evidence, these are pretty much adaptive farm level research. This applies to agricultural sciences, FYI. Type of research, is it a meta-analysis or is it a systematic review? Study design, where these field trials or systematic reviews or greenhouse trials and experiments, etc. And if that's the case, then that qualifies as substantiated, documented evidence. So we can just now, out of those screened articles, can we now grade, pick the top of the crib? We've screened maybe out of 50, we chopped it down to 25. Out of those 25, which are the top grade? And it kind of gives a hierarchy of sorts. Which one should we prioritize? Which one should I start reading? Where should I start extracting my notes from, and etc. So you could use this and you have that ranking, very strong, moderate, somewhat low, or, you know, partially substantiated evidence, etc. And this again gives, or rather is another quality check, and allows one to confidently say that my review is evidence-based because our search wasn't biased. We did a quality assessment, screening stage, screening articles, manual screening or using the softwares, and we did this grading using the Koutsos method to actually come up with the cream of our search. All right. So again, this is available online and available on Google Scholar for download. Makes for a very interesting reading for students that are really keen to expand, or the curious ones, their knowledge. So once you've done that, you've done a two-step screening process or a cleaning process or a cleanup process, again, it's important that I mention emerging sciences. We need not turn a blind eye on them, all right? So this method might not work for your emerging sciences because it's not extensively published. So if I really want to do a quality check, do I have to screen? If I screen, I probably would remain with 1 or 3 articles, and that's not really enough. But it's enough to build an argument if you scope that, okay, this subject matter isn't really researched, that's why I have to do this. I want to expand the frontiers of knowledge. But for quality purposes, you could actually use this. Just grade that this is what I did. I graded my articles and I had this N number of articles or X number of articles that had strong evidence, substantiated and documented evidence. These were partially substantiated. There's potential evidence and there wasn't evidence at all. All right. So it's another quality check, and it's also another leeway out for those that are engaged in groundbreaking emerging science that not or that aren't extensively published. So the final outcome in a picture is pretty much this, right? You have 500 articles for starters. Check for duplication, and a duplication check. This is quite routine. You've downloaded, you check for duplications. That's a screening method of sorts. After checking duplication, you screen again and using your softwares based on your inclusion and exclusion criteria. And you further refine using that Kutzos method. At the end of the day, you just want to have a certain number of articles that make sense, that answer your research objective, and that provide substantiated evidence on your review that you eventually produce. So remember, apply those Pico Spider frameworks, break it down to search words, combine using Boolean operators, then you retrieve a plantation of articles to say, and screen those and keep screening, quality check, and at the end of the day, you just want to have clean articles of relevance. And most of the times you'd figure out, you start off with 100 or 200, a lot of articles, 200. If you do a thorough screening patiently, because it's a painstaking process, you've got to be committed and dedicated. Patiently screen through, paying attention to detail, you would figure out at the end of the day, out of those 200, you could actually have 34 articles to work with. All right, so that's the nature of the process, but painful as it is, it ensures that there's quality in the review that you produce, and quality in science is what matters. We are all obliged to produce quality research, quality reviews, informative, non-biased. All right, that's our obligation. So just to wrap it up, it's almost an hour now. We are not throwing all reviews under the bus. If you and your supervisors are comfortable doing that, and you know that they are comprehensive, exhaustive, and very thorough, well and good, but they'll say things can be better, all right? And this approach, another closing remark, can be limiting. Like I said, they are emerging sciences and they are not extensively published, so there's a dearth of information of sorts. So you really can't just screen, because at the end of the day, you have nothing. So you could just jump straight to that Kutzos method and just rank. In a way, it's some quality assurance or a quality method that you've used to rank your articles in terms of evidence-based, amount of evidence, substantiated, partially or no evidence at all. That would also put some confidence, all right? And we spoke about the meta-analysis, but just in brief, I'll just say that it's very, it's encouraged that we do reviews more meta-analysis like, because they are really solid, and we need to encourage our postgrad students like we do down here. We really actually push them to do that. And it's a skill, trust me, once you acquire that skill, very useful in whatever reviews that you do. And it somehow subconsciously sticks to your mind, and you are very thorough. Even if you're doing a rapid review, you are pretty much inclined just to apply these methods subconsciously, and you'll be surprised by the quality of work you produce, really. And it's also, again, a big plus for you, because if you produce a meta-analysis, a proper meta-analysis, you increase your chances of getting published with your research, starting off with a literature review. So a few references that I've used, you can also follow up on those appendages, these pictures that have been that I attached, that you can follow through these documents within the text and search for extra reading. So this, ladies and gentlemen, marks the end of this class, and the floor is open for questions, opinions, criticism, and discussions in general. Thank you. Over to you, Monde.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tinashe. That was a very insightful presentation. Sometimes we don't take literature review so serious. I didn't know all these details of searching and all that. It's quite insightful. The floor is open for those who are online to ask questions. Any comments?
If I may, I could just maybe ask a question to the floor. If there's anyone who ever tried this approach and what was their experience, I think it would be something nice to hear from other practitioners. If there's anyone in the room that's tried this before, and what are their experiences, the opportunities, challenges, areas that we can collectively talk about for improvement and etc. I mean, this is what this is all about. At the end of the day, we need to share tips and help each other improve.
Okay, no one has ever done a meta-analysis here. Online, in my room here, there's no one. It's news.
I'm on.
Yeah, Rennie.
I'm not a good candidate to respond to this because Dr. Dirwai is my coach on the subject. So I'm not sure what diverse input I can provide because I'm literally being mentored by him on the subject. And I'm not doing a meta-analysis. We were looking at a scoping review for that purpose, which is less analytic and more descriptive in comparison to the meta-analysis. So I had to just acknowledge Dr. Dirwai for the guidance he's been given me, and I'm still in my learning, my learning pathway. So I can't contribute much when my coach has just spoken. I don't have anything contrary to that. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Rennie. Well, a student has to be better than his. I was expecting some questions from you, but it's all right. I would say just a passing comment. Sometimes it's something that researchers or other practitioners don't really talk about, especially when you do a set strategy and, you know, in Scopus or in any database. You use those Boolean operators and the combination of those words. Sometimes they don't really give you the relevant studies. So it's incumbent on you, the researcher, to do a trial and error approach, which will allow you to refine the search strategy itself. Sometimes you might follow the spider in Pico and you figure out, okay, this thing is taking me way off the target. What can I do? What words can I use? What kind of Boolean operator can I combine with it? With which words can I combine with certain Boolean operators to yield the best search results? So again, it's not a guarantee that once you apply those Boolean operators and the Picos and the spider approaches, you'll get the best results. Try it out, see why it's, see the kind of results that it's yielding. And if you're not happy or if it's way off the mark, you can change those search results. And you need to tell us in the methodology that first trial, it yielded this n number of articles, and maybe 10, and out of those 10, 8 were irrelevant. So we changed our search strategies and strings to this, which eventually led to yielding this number of articles, which we eventually used for the synthesis. So the whole essence, I think it's very important that we communicate every step of the way in the methodology, just as you would when you're writing an experimental chapter or experimental manuscript. You communicate your step-by-step processes that you did when doing the experiments, the pitfalls, the shortfalls, the challenges, and that way, it enhances science and the eventual outcome of the research on that particular subject. But yeah, that should be all. Yeah, I see Victoria as a hand up. Yeah, Victoria, let's hear from you.
Thank you, Doc, for a very nice presentation. I hear you focusing more on the Scopus and Web of Science as the search engines. My question is, would Google Scholar carry the same value, or what do you say on that?
All right, thank you for your question. So essentially, stuff that you find on Google Scholar, these databases are kind of interlinked. The whole database indexing allows these interlinkages. So essentially, material that you can find on Google Scholar can be found on Scopus. And why did I put emphasis on Scopus and Web of Science? These databases are very comprehensive and overarching. It's almost nearly impossible not to find articles on these on a particular subject on the two databases. And it's just common practice, all right? Not to take away the fact that you said Google Scholar. Why do we shy away from Google Scholar? Google Scholar allows us to literally punch in what exactly we are looking for. And in a way, there's some sort of bias because we have an end result in mind already, and we know the kind of articles that we want to retrieve. But why not give this methodology a chance that would allow us to actually have access to more? Because if you use certain search strings in Google Scholar, you are limited to what it is that you've typed on the search bar. If you use Booleans, they are overarching, they pull in all sorts of articles on a particular subject, and it gives you options. Hence, you tick that box, it's exhaustive. Searches have to be exhaustive all the time. I hope I answered you.
Yes, it's clear, Doc. Thank you.
Pleasure. Over to you, Chair.
Yeah, it looks like there are no more questions, no comments. And I think this is the end of the presentation. At this juncture, I would just like to thank Dr. Tinashe for sharing this information to us. At the moment, our program the students are actually new. They are still new students, and I think from here they'll be able to search their literature extensively and well. So thank you very much for your presentation. And thank you to all those who joined us online. We hope to see you again next week. Next week, we have 2 seminars on a Wednesday as well, morning and afternoon. So please join us.
All right. Thank you for hosting me, and pleasure to make all your acquaintances.
Thank you, Dr. Diwai. Monday.
Thank you. Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.